Several years ago, Carol Dweck discovered that positive feedback is not always good feedback. Through a number of different research studies, Dweck found that some forms of positive feedback actually create anxiety, paralysis, and a focus upon performance. Others created curiosity, experimentation, and learning. For example, if you bring a child in front of an audience with a room full of instruments and introduce the child as a brilliant pianist, the child will play the piano up to just below the limits of their abilities. But if instead you introduce the child as a kid who is great at learning to play instruments, the child will play the piano to the very best of their abilities, and they may decide to give a little performance on the drums and try out the clarinet. One form of praise limits the child. The other form of praise opens up new possibilities. Dweck called this dichotomy the fixed mindset versus the growth mindset. The difference between them is not whether the child received positive praise. The difference was in what kind of positive praise. In the online setting, we oftentimes find ourselves struggling to provide positive feedback. I have frequently discovered that I gave all of my time and attention to students who needed correction and robbed the student who is doing well of positive feedback. Really good teachers adjust and provide both correction and praise to both the struggling student and the one who seems to be doing well. But we want to offer another challenge, one that helps students become increasingly capable and empowered to direct their own learning. What does it look like to provide feedback that not only corrects or encourages students to perform better, but instead invites them to reach into knowledge, experiences, and challenges, and discoveries that are yet unknown to them? How can we create self-directed learners? When I first read Mary Ellen Weimer's book, Learner-Centered Teaching: 5 Keys to Practice, I found myself thinking about teachers who had the most impact upon my desire to learn. I thought of my second grade teacher, who never had a nice thing to say about my learning or anything else about me. I thought about my third grade teacher, who saved me academically and gave our class room to discover art, music, and even Shakespeare. But the person I thought of most was Jeff Childers, a faculty member in the Bible department at ACU. I took a class from Jeff when I was working on a Master's of Art in Religion degree back in the late 90s. It was a history course, and I wrote a paper on the conversion of Iceland to Christianity in 1000 AD. It was a lot of fun. I stretched myself as hard as I could. I worked hard to show him that I understood the historiography that he had tried to teach us. I was expecting to demonstrate my expertise in barbarian conversion and support my thesis that this was largely driven by economics. But when he read my paper, he wrote something that changed my behavior in his class. He wrote, "I learned a lot from your paper." I hadn't prepared for that feedback. I had prepared to show him that I was doing great work. His feedback, however, ignited an entirely different goal. I wanted to teach him something else. From that moment on, I was on a mission to get that same feedback. I no longer wanted to prove that I was a good student. Instead, I wanted to see how much I could learn and whether Jeff was also learning from that endeavor. We'd like to challenge you to consider what forms of feedback incite the kinds of intrinsic motivation to learn, rather than the extrinsic motivation to please the professor or minimize criticism or avoid a bad grade or keep a 4.0. Like Jeff, what forms of feedback do you imagine you might give to students to help them strive for growth and learning rather than fixed performance? Here are some ideas that might get you moving in that reflection. First, consider addressing the power differential. Msilla in 2020 noted that a focus on self-determined learning enables teachers to share teaching with their students. This liberation approach to learning attempts to flatten the typical hierarchy of teacher-student relationships. For example, I have lately tried to stop telling students, "I'm proud of you," even though some students could use that kind of encouragement. Instead, I've been trying to say to my students, "You deserve to be proud of yourself." It's a slight variation, but one that attempts to reverse the assumption that the student's job is to please me. Their job is to learn for themselves. Focusing on the power differential can illuminate a number of phrases we tend to use out of habit, like, "Thanks for a great paper," "I was happy to see you do so well," or even "excellent job." These can all carry the inference that the student has succeeded in pleasing the eminent professor. Other phrases, such as, "I can see your efforts here," or "This is difficult material you're mastering," or "I really admire your writing," can even, if just slightly, shift the power away from the instructor and toward the student. All of these are examples of positive feedback. We can try to flatten out the power differential in formative feedback as well. For example, if I tell a student, "Don't use a comma here," I have issued a command. Instead, if there is an error, point it out. Even better, provide resources so that the student can learn about commas. I'll say more about that in a moment. I once had a Shakespeare professor who turned my paper back to me and said, "I don't read papers with more than 4 grammatical errors." What I actually heard was, "I am a very important professor whose time is too precious to waste on those who don't meet my standards." Second, identify the difference between competency and capability. Moore, in 2020, provides a fascinating example of this by the analogy of a firefighter. Firefighters need basic skills to put out fires. Moore equates those to competencies. Capabilities, however, are when the firefighter applies those competencies to a specific fire. What is especially important here is that capability is often discovered through a double loop of action, reflection, and adaptation. In truth, our approaches to learning often don't give room for the development of capabilities. The student who seems to get it are the ones who matriculate, and the students who guessed wrong more often do not matriculate. In other words, capabilities are developed through iterative experiences. Knowing that Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 is competence. Experimenting with applying that knowledge, reflecting upon the application, and then reapplying that knowledge is a very different task. In our course designs for the online setting, iteration is not always easy to accomplish. But instructors who recognize the value and importance of iterative feedback are especially powerful in the fast-paced approach to independent learning that we use here at ACU Dallas. Instead of merely saying, "That application didn't work," consider giving the student a means of reflection. I could react to an argument in a paragraph with, "That didn't make sense," or I could give the student a chance to reflect upon the argument with a bit of support and guidance, and then let them try that paragraph again. Not the whole paper, just that paragraph or just that sentence. Third, we'd really like to challenge you to be informative in your feedback. If we're not precious potentates who need to be pleased by our students, and if we're willing to embrace the iterative nature of learning, we can close the loop of empowered learning by giving students what they need to grow and develop. In the spring of 2020, I started a new job here, and for a good 3 months, I struggled to understand the goals, processes, and organization of my new role. And so, as I fumbled my way through meetings and notes and links in Google Docs, I found myself asking questions that I knew I'd heard the answer to in the past. At one point, I asked someone a question, and she acted surprised that I asked it. "I thought I already told you what to do in this situation." In a moment of transparent exasperation, I said, "Dude, you told me all kinds of things that I forgot, and I'm still in the process of forgetting and re-remembering." Telling students to, quote, "figure it out" is great advice. I love the old adage, give a person a fish, you feed them for a day. Teach a person to fish, you feed them for life. In fact, I'll go a third level. Teach a person how to learn how to fish, and they can learn to do other things without you teaching them. But this should not be an excuse for withholding information or support. In fact, resourcing our students can be especially powerful. Exhaustive feedback that provides a wealth of resources can be a great way to invite students to discovery and development. But exhaustive feedback need not be exhausting to the faculty member. I mentioned commas earlier. Commas and I have a love-hate relationship for most of my life, so when students commit a comma error, I like to refer them to some of the same resources that I've found useful. One way to do this is to create a document of common feedback notes and provide links and resources that students can access to learn more about your feedback. I don't need to teach about comma splices. I can just resource the student so they can find more information. I learned this approach from Karen Maxwell, who is one of the best online teachers I know. And over time, my approach has evolved. I used to have a document with grading slugs that I could copy and paste into comments on students' papers. More recently, I moved those into Text Expander, which is a program that lets me assign a shortcut that expands into prepared text. So now, when I see a comma splice, I just type a shortcut and the student is provided with resources to learn what a comma splice is and how to fix it. So to review, the 3 recommendations we're making toward this effort to incite intrinsic motivation in your students are to 1. Address the power differential, 2. Provide room for reflection and iteration, and 3. Resource your students in feedback. What are some of the practices you already engage in to try and empower your students toward intrinsic motivation? What are some of the challenges that you believe might result from this approach? What one new thing are you willing to try to help empower your students to become independent learners? Let us know how the Center for Online Development and Innovation can help you excel still more in your teaching.